All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event today, Black Muslim Revolutions from the Masjid to the World, with Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer and Dr. Rasul Miller. This is the third event in our Black Islam in the Americas series this semester. My name is Aliyah Khan, and I'm Director of the Global Islamic Studies Center at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Our center is your host today. First, a little about us and our events this year. The Global Islamic Studies Center aims to promote the understanding of global Islamic culture and Muslim societies worldwide, not just the Middle East, but Asia, Africa, and the Americas. If you are a student, faculty, staff, or community member who's interested in our talks, film festivals, and research funding, please make sure to join our monthly newsletter to stay informed and attend our events. In addition, if you're an undergraduate student, declare our Islamic Studies minor. The minor itself has no prerequisites and is 16 credits. You can find more information on our minor page on our website, but please also reach out and contact us, and we'll make sure you have everything you need to declare. If you're interested in graduate programs, check out our Masters in International and Regional Studies with an Islamic Studies specialization. The deadline is usually mid-December, and you can find more info on our website. Master's program is 36 credits total and is usually pursued over the course of 2 years. Again, contact us for more information. If you're looking for funding, our applications are currently open for undergraduate students, graduate students, and faculty looking for funding for projects related to Islam and Muslim societies. Our applications for funding close April 29th. If you have a month, make sure to apply before then. For graduate students, we fund any projects related to Islamic studies and to Muslim societies. This includes travel, conference fees, language learning courses, and more. For undergrads, we fund digital internships, language learning, local conference fees, internship stipends, and more. Of special note today is that we also have a new graduate fellowship dedicated solely to the study of Black Islam. As part of this Black Islam in the Americas series, and in collaboration with our colleague who will speak today, Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer, and the Arab and Muslim American Studies Program in American Culture, of which she is director, we have launched the Black Islam Graduate Fellowship Competition that is open to all U of M graduate students in relevant fields working in the Americas, Africa, the Middle East, and Black Muslim communities elsewhere. Applications close on April 29th. We have one more major event this semester. On April 5th at 1 p.m., we'll be hosting a roundtable and book launch for the book Mantle of Mercy, Islamic Chaplaincy in North America, which is the first essay collection on the growing field of Islamic chaplaincy in the United States and Canada. The editors and some of the book contributors will be speaking on their experiences as Muslim chaplains and spiritual caregivers on university campuses, at hospitals, in corrections institutions, and in the wider Muslim community. As you can see here, we are inviting editors Chaplain Muhammad Ali, Chaplain Sondo Holaki, Sister J. Starr, to convene with Imam Kamal Ayubi of Michigan Medicine and U of M Campus Felicity Foundation Chaplain Dr. Matthew Schumann to discuss Mantle of Mercy, as well as their experiences as Muslim chaplains. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Nancy Khalil, faculty in American Culture. Today's event, Black Muslim Revolutions from the Masjid to the World, is brought to you by the Global Islamic Studies Center at the University of Michigan as the culmination of our three-part Black Islam in the Americas series this March, hopefully to be continued next year. This series explores the history of Black Islam and the experiences of Black Muslim communities in the Americas, including North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We previously hosted a film screening and then a filmmaker talkback on the film Two Gods, with the screening made possible thanks to Good Docs. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors that made this series possible at the University of Michigan, the Department of American Culture and the Arab and Muslim American Studies program, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum, the African Studies Center, the LSA Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the International Institute. This series is also brought to you by the Maidan at George Mason University's Aliyah Al-Aqsa Center for Global Islamic Studies and the Muslim Studies program at Michigan State University. If you'd like to keep up with us, you can follow us on Facebook or on Twitter. We are at UMich GISC on both those platforms, and we also send out a monthly newsletter. Please feel free to subscribe. I'd now like to introduce and welcome our two speakers today. They'll be talking to us and to each other on their work and on transnational formations of Black Islam. Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer is Associate Professor of American Culture and Director of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program at the University of Michigan. She's a scholar, artist, activist, and author of Muslim Cool: Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in the United States, published in 2016. She is also the founder of Sapelo Square, the Black Muslim online community. Dr. Abdul Khabeer received her PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton University. She's a graduate of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and she completed the Islamic Studies Diploma program of the Institute at Abu Nur University in Damascus. In her recent work, Umi's Archive, Dr. Abdul Khabeer examines the intersections of official history and the untold stories of Black women and Black Muslims through the lens of her mother's life. Umi means mother in Arabic, and Dr. Abdul Khabeer examines her mother's photographic and literary archives. So the digital exhibition series is called Umi's Archive. The project sees everyday Black women as people who know things we all need to know. Our second speaker, Dr. Rasul Miller, is Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Miller's work explores the histories of Black Muslim communities in the Atlantic world, Black radicalism, and its impact on social and cultural movements in the 20th century US, Black internationalism, and West African intellectual history. Dr. Miller's current book project, Black World Revelation: Islam, Race, and Radical Internationalism in New York City from 1930 to 1990, examines the Black internationalist origins of early 20th century Black Orthodox Muslim congregations in and around New York City, and the cultural and political orientations that characterize subsequent communities of Black Muslims in the US, who built robust transnational networks as they actively engage traditions and communities of Muslims on the African continent. Just as a word, during and after discussion, we invite you to send in your audience questions through the Q&A function on your screen. Please use that to send us your questions, and I will read them out loud for our participants, whom I would now like to invite to turn your cameras on. All right, so Dr. Suad and Dr. Rasul, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Dr. Suad, you and I talk constantly, but it's nice to see you, Rasul, coming in from California. I hope both of you are doing well. I want to start us off today by just asking each of you to take a turn telling us about what's moving you today. You know, I read these bios, but I think, you know, we would like to hear, what are you working on right now? What is moving you and motivating you right now? So Suad, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so thank you, Aliyah and Hannah and everyone at Global Islamic Studies Center for this invitation. You know, I was just thinking, last week I did a keynote lecture for another Global Islamic Studies Center, the one at George Mason University. My topic was, the title I gave, I was trying to be controversial. It was, can we really talk about race? Oh, the conference they were having was a race and global Islam conference. So the title I gave my talk was, can we really talk about race in Islam, or will scholars keep frying? And so I was trying to get at a couple of things of what's moving me. I think I just want to say, before I get to that, I think, it's interesting for me as someone who, when I started doing sort of academic scholarship around Blackness and Islam, there were people who definitely came before me, right? So someone like Dr. Amanal McLeod Al-Din, someone like, Azain Abdullah, or these different people who are sort of doing this work, but it was sort of a couple of people here or there, right? There weren't conferences, there wasn't a lot of sort of interest, I think, what is a very significant part of what it means to think about what Islam is in the world, beyond, right, people who are so specifically focusing on it. So it's a treat to sort of have an opportunity in two different spaces, right, to sort of think about these questions. I also want to begin in the name of Allah, for love of Muhammad, to honor the ancestors and the celebration of my people. I also begin as a descendant of stolen people on stolen land, an acknowledgement that the land upon which I am, in what we call North America, is the unceded and ancestral territory of the peoples of Turtle Island, and some of us are uninvited guests. But I'm hopeful that these land acknowledgements can turn into tangible action, so we no longer have to be. I also begin acknowledgement, that of the histories of resistance, as well as oppression and white supremacy that brought us to this moment today, that every land is Karbala and every day is Ashura. And finally, I want to begin just an acknowledgement briefly of Dr. Deborah Majid. Dr. Deborah Majid was a formidable Islamic studies scholar, teacher, activist, community member who passed away last week. She's particularly known for her work around Muslim womanism and her work around African-American Muslims' lives. And so I think, I hope that the work that we talk about today and what we do in the future can continue to, build on the legacy she left behind, because she definitely left a legacy behind. And so I think thinking about all those things in terms of my own work, I think what moves me is, so currently I'm working on Umi's Archive, right, which is a project that I did not anticipate. I did not see that in my future. 3 years, with 2022, so 5 years ago, when this project actually started 5 years ago, because of my mother's passing. It was a sudden and unexpected death. And, I had previous to that, I interviewed her once because I knew she had lived a remarkable life. I knew she was connected to a lot of national, local, and transnational networks, right? And she had participated in efforts around thinking about that intersection of Blackness and Islam, which is really about liberation and Black liberation, the way that she would frame it. And so I knew that, but that wasn't what I was going to study. Because I was like, I did Muslim Cool, which, I'm a hip hop head. So it was really great. I care about these questions of Blackness and Islam when I looked at it through hip hop, but I was done with the Muslims. I was done with all that. I wanted to do something different. And then she passed away. And as you do, this kind of the death cleaning you do when people pass away, I began to sort of, kind of the different things, the stories I had heard from her or other people in the community, right, began to sort of come alive in the different materials that I was kind of coming across. And it occurred to me, or I felt compelled really to think about this as something that is not just something that I should put in a box somewhere and be like, oh, those are some cute things that happened in the past, but really take it seriously, right? And really think about, the generation that she's a part of, right? These sort of Black US American Muslims who came to Islam in the late 60s and early 70s were world builders, right? They were making new worlds. They came from Pan-Africanists, they came from Black internationalists, they came from Black radical traditions, they came to Islam with that. And the idea of being Muslim then was about continuing that praxis. And so it wasn't something just that should be, on a shelf somewhere in my house, but it really was something that I thought, needed to be shared with other people, because one, they're going to see their own relationships to that, right, in their own sort of histories, as well as, I think, like I say, Black women as people who know things we all need to know, we are facing extinction, right? Like that is what we are facing as a species, right? And so the stakes probably have never been higher everything from climate change to the sort of long durée white supremacy to war to poverty, right? And I think that these women, right, who are world builders and world makers have something and they have knowledge that we can benefit from today. And so I wanted to sort of try to make that accessible. And so, Umi's archive is, it's a multi-pronged kind of project. So, it first started out as a series of online exhibitions that I launched last year. I'm working on a book that's going to come out of that. There were also performance because I am an artist. And so for the exhibitions, there were a couple of sort of short pieces that I created for that as well. And I think, I'll just say, one of the best compliments I got about Women's Archive was for someone who knew my mother, who I have interviewed as a part of the project. And this person said, when I look at the project, it has sort of the, and I gotta actually remember it better because it was very eloquent the way they said it, but it has like the eye of the scholar, the passion of an activist, and the heart of a child. And I was like, yo, that really does encapsulate everything that's going on here. And that's important to me because I think my trajectory as a scholar, as someone who does work in the academy, is to blur the boundaries between academy and art, between the academy and the public, right? My goal is to, because, I think there is a tendency, right, in academic spaces, really defined by kind of Eurocentric notions of, what is knowledge and what matters, to think that we have to be separate from our work in this kind of way. And I think, the idea that you can come to something from a variety of different vantage points, to me, enriches what you're doing, right? It creates more depth and more sort of breadth of what you're doing. Because of course, you're going to do what you're doing and someone else is going to do it and they're going to have a comment and it is going to be an exchange. That's the point, right? The point is for us to learn from each other and to learn from the different works, learn from our past and the present so we can build the future. So Umi's archive is kind of my way of doing that, right? It's a way of identifying the value, the epistemological value, the methodological value of everyday Black women, everyday Black Muslim women and their lives and their life histories, as well as I think also having, and this is what moves me, thinking about how we can sort of free the production of knowledge in university spaces from these kind of ideas and standards that aren't liberatory, that don't provide, don't give us the opportunity to really maximize, and maybe that's not the word, but don't give us the opportunity to really invest in and to learn from the breadth of everything that humanity has to offer each other, as opposed to keeping it very narrow. So I'll end.
No, thank you for that. I think we got like something like, between 5 and 50 different points. We could just go, we could start with here, starting and ending with interrogating academic epistemology and how that functions. But Rasul, let me turn it over to you. What's moving you right now? What's motivating you?
What's moving me? What's motivating? Well, first of all, thank you so much. This is awesome to be in conversation with quite frankly, some of my folks that are doing some of the work that I'm the most excited about in academia, both of you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Nabi al-Ami wa azwaji muhammad wa dhurriyyati wa ahlil bayt kama sallaita ala Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Bismillah. So, I've never done a land acknowledgement, but and I'm not about to do one now. But I really appreciate what you said, Dr. Suad, about some of us are uninvited guests, but hopefully these land acknowledgements can turn into something more tangible. So you've given me something to chew on about how this can be a step towards something more significant. I've had some conversations with my wife about this as well, about land acknowledgements and the significance of that. So anyway, what's moving me? So what's moving me right now is trying to get this book done. I'm working on a book based on my dissertation research. And it's called, I've kind of just newly minted a new tentative title, Black World Revelations, or Black World Revelation. And essentially, as I hope the title kind of intimates, what I'm looking at and what I'm interested about is the ways in which Black internationalism and a kind of global Black consciousness helps to sort of foster the development of Black Muslim communities. I focused at communities in and around New York City. Primarily Black, what we might call quote unquote orthodox Muslim communities, which is a what's the word? It's a word with a lot of baggage to it. So maybe we can unpack that a bit. But part of what I am sort of looking at is the ways in which debates around, sort of whether or not to prioritize a kind of internationalist political perspective or a more domestically oriented, struggle to create, power and self-determination in the domestic sphere, whether or not to prioritize or which of those sort of projects to prioritize. And so what I argue is that as you see the emergence of Black Orthodox Muslim communities, both Black Orthodox Muslim communities and communities like the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, are both involved in both of those projects. They're globally minded, but they're also trying to build power locally. But a part of what sort of distinguishes Black Orthodox Muslim communities from others is a sort of prioritizing of the kind of internationalist perspective and project. And that has a lot of different iterations, right? Whether it's a kind of Pan-Africanist orientation or a kind of, radical internationalist orientation, or this kind of, we might call Islamic internationalism of Islamist, I don't like that word, but Islamist groups like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Jamiat al-Islamiyya, all those sort of iterations of that. And for me, I think part of why that's important is, or why that sort of, matters is, one, I think it can change the way we think about internationalism as something that sometimes gets articulated through religion, not just through a kind of, left political Marxist or communist kind of language. And obviously there's overlap between the two, but, the way in which this kind of internationalist perspective sort of permeates, everyday working class Black folks in their spaces and their religious communities. And then also for folks who are interested in, or for the conversation around sort of Islam globally, we often think about a kind of Islamic internationalism that foregrounds the Middle East or maybe South Asia. And, part of what I found really interesting is these communities that I'm looking at, for these communities, Africa is really central, so often it's an internationalism that's expressed through, Pan-Africanism or kind of African cultural nationalism, things like that. This is one of the reasons why I really, find both of you all's work to be really instructive. I think, we're in some similar kinds of conversations. And I think, to the question of what's moving me right now, I'm seeing how sort of relevant this is in the midst of discussions around kind of an internationalist versus a kind of domestic political project, for sort of working class Black folks, people talking about ADOS and this idea of foundational Black Americans. And in the academy, some of the debates and discussions that emerge around things like Afro-pessimism. And so I think folks in Black Muslim communities have been having these debates, and I think have, come away with some important positions, right? And come to some important realizations about that I think are instructive for folks that are having the conversation today. And, it's interesting, when Dr. Suad, when you started Umi's Archive, it was a real kind of, revelation, because a lot of the folks that I'm writing about, are very much a part of the same circles, friendship groups, doing the same kind of work. And similarly, what I found is that, there are a lot of people who aren't famous, who had a lot to say and who did a lot, right? And so that's a big part of what, I'm trying to foreground in the work as well. Did a lot of oral histories, that kind of brought that out. And the last thing I'll say is it's also kind of sparked what I think will be a second book, which is looking specifically, or inshallah will look specifically at, Muslims who were engaged in certain kinds of Black radical organizing that really embraced a particular kind of a particular kind of radical internationalism. So people who are part of political formations like the Black Panther Party in New York City, the Republic of New Africa, and others. And people who emerged out of these communities are among some of the folks who are still incarcerated, held hostage as political prisoners. Some of the longest held political prisoners in this country are folks who come out of this context, come out of this milieu, a lot of them Muslim. Alhamdulillah, we have a couple that have recently gotten their freedom in recent years. People like Baba Sekou Odinga and Jalil Muntaqin, may Allah preserve them. But there's a lot more that are still incarcerated that we got to work to bring home. So that's, I think, a part of what's moving me and what I want to kind of amplify as we start the conversation off.
No, thank you to both of you. And I think there's a lot of connecting threads there. One that I want to pick up on is, just for you to elaborate to our audience about what you think Black revolutionary and civil rights history, how does that intersect with the history of Black Islam? Because I think, we are used to studying these things separately. And one thing that both of you are not doing is studying them separately. You are studying them together as part and parcel of each other, and not just implying, but saying explicitly that Black revolutionary movements in the United States are deeply tied to Islam. What is the significance of making that assertion? And is it the case that we have not been making that kind of assertion? And then it becomes personal too, like, Saad, your mother was a Black Panther. So that is personal to Umi's archives too. Have we not been making these connections all of the time before? Is this new in scholarship for both of you?
I was going to give Rasul the first on that, since that's
so in terms of, you're asking like sort of bringing the personal into the work, is that new?
It can be that too, but I'm just fascinated by the way that you are linking Black revolutionary movements in the United States and abroad to Islam.
Right. So, I mean, it's definitely not new on the ground, right? It's how people have been living and working, but I think it is in some ways relatively new with regard to how, Islam has been talked about, I think, academically, at least in the US context. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think and I won't go through a field statement, right? But if we go through kind of just the genealogies of scholarship on Islam in America, a lot of the literature penned in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on the Nation of Islam in particular, and it's not through no fault of the Nation of Islam, I should say, really kind of focused on this kind of domestic. I mean, I think just the way religion is thought about in the States, right? It's thought about as a private matter, right? Something you do in your home, right? And when people are talking about, different forms of radicality and revolution, it's imagined to be a secular affair, right? And I think the experience of Black folk, demonstrates that that's nonsense, right? And I think that those discourses have definitely impacted the way early scholarship on 20th century Islam in America took shape. Go back to C. Eric Lincoln, Black Muslims in America, which I'm not trying to begrudge C. Eric Lincoln. I think he did a good work for his time, but he was caught up in a lot of stuff. Malcolm himself said, I never wanted us to be called Black Muslims. Like, we were Muslims, right? That's a framing that really comes out of like the state, law enforcement, that kind of thing. Similar to the way folks who study Islam in West Africa will be familiar with this idea of Islam noir, this idea of a Black Islam that's somehow, pathological and not that authentic and very kind of parochial and domestic, right? And so I think that's part of what's at hand. And also I think that there's a way in which the ways in which Black Muslims have understood themselves as a part of a larger global context has really gone under the radar, which is part of what that I hope, we can kind of tease out, because it's imagined. I mean, the second project that I want to do that looks at, these like Muslims who are part of these like radical formations. One of the reasons why I wanted to do it is because I think when you have conversations about revolution, right? The presumption is that if you're talking about revolution, particularly if you're talking about a kind of internationalist approach to revolution, this is sort of antithetical to religion. Even if we sort of historicize the Black Panther Party, we think about the Black Panther Party as a sort of Black Marxist kind of, political formation. But if you really examine the roots of the Black Panther Party, you find some of the first folks to use this terminology of the Black Panther Party were people like Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture, who had some interesting things to say about Islam, particularly at the end of his life when he was in Guinea. people like Professor Muhammad Ahmed, Max Stanford. Even when you look at the sort of third and most sort of famous instantiation of a Black Panther Party founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, these are folks that are interested in the Nation of Islam and what Honorable Elijah Muhammad is doing as well. And then when you go to the East Coast, you find all of these Muslims with African-inspired names who are the founders of the Black Panther Party in New York City. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why that connection sort of has flown under the radar. But I think the spirit of that, and to some degree, the memory of that is still alive among communities, right? So as is often the case, academia kind of has to catch up to what Black folks are doing on the ground.
Yeah, I think I can echo what Russell was saying. For me, the sort of classic example of this is Malcolm X, right? Who, is a professed and practicing Muslim until the day he is murdered, right? Whether he was practicing Islam as a member of the Nation of Islam, or whether he's practicing Islam sort of as a kind of, I guess, under the sort of broader sort of Sunni umbrella, right? Yet most of our public imagination of him is not as a Muslim, right? Even in spaces, in radical spaces, people thinking, it's like his politics, his revolution, but his Islam is sort of peripheral, if acknowledged at all, right? And so I think that is something we see a lot. And I think Russell's point about the state has a lot to do with that. I think about this piece that Sylvia Chan-Malik wrote some time ago, and she was responding to, sort of the kind of, every quarter there's some sort of, mainstream news conversation about Minister Louis Farrakhan, right? So she's responding to, it's like, you can kind of time it when this is going to happen. And she made this point about the ways in which, and I think this was in particular, I won't get to, I don't want to misspeak the frame of the article, but one of the points she makes is that there's a way in which the Nation of Islam, right, comes in to stand for sort of all sort of Black Muslim practice, and the Nation of Islam is sort of identified as a state as not real Islam, not even religious, right? So about linking as like a political organization, right? And very domestic, despite its international, right, internationalist sort of the real relationships, as well as kind of some of the, in the sense of the kind of cosmology, right, of the organization of the group. And so being pit, and we see this, right, in that famously in that The Hate Produced, the documentary from the late 50s, right, that Mike Wells was a part of, that was on PBS, right, in this positioning of sort of the Nation of Islam, Black Muslims as other than real Islam, right? And that has a particular, I think, political, a particular political benefit. And this is what I'm talking about with Chan-Malik's work, this idea that, one of the things we can say, we think about the United States as a country, as a settler colony, as an empire, there's this rhetoric of multiculturalism, right, that is really prominent. And Black people, right, African Americans, Black Americans, right, become sort of incorporated in that narrative of multiculturalism and American exceptionalism, right? These people used to be slaves. Look, they've had a president type of thing. Like, this is the kind of way the story goes. And I think Muslims as a group, right, can also sometimes be fit in that idea of multiculturalism, right? This idea of some, the kind of upwardly mobile Muslim immigrant person, like anyone can do it here. On the flip side, right, Black people can be threatening and Muslims can be threatening. But those two groups, Black and Muslim, have to be separate, right? And they have to maintain separateness to be sort of deployed as either way. When you put when that discrete category gets blended or gets sort of added together, I think that really just kind of disturbs the logic. It really just makes it like, what's going on here? And I think, into Russell's point about what's on the ground, and even think of Ms. Louis Farrakhan, criticisms that people might have of him, one thing is true is that he's going to keep you honest, right? In terms of questions of sort of US imperialism and racial oppression, right? These are the things that are going to, when the Black Muslim comes into the room, these are the kind of things they're going to be talking about. And so if there's a particular, I think, political interest in a a view of the US in one way, to the Black Muslim becomes a problem. And so I think the kind of the ways in which that relationship gets obscured, it gets hidden, it doesn't get talked about, it gets denied, I think are in many ways, like Rasul was saying, tied to sort of state objectives, right? And which can play themselves out in scholarship and research, and of course the media narratives, right? Which are often, kind of in tune, right, with the state's objectives.
Mm-hmm. I think pulling out a thread that both of you are getting at here, I think let's figure out how can we define the term Black Islam, and how do we position all of the different constituencies that this term covers underneath that one umbrella. Where does that place African Muslims? Where does that place African American Muslims? What is the relationality to immigrant Muslims? Pardon. What is the relationship between, African American Muslims, people who have been in this country for generations, to immigrant Muslims within this formulation of Black Islam, especially if we are talking about, picking up on something Suad said, the way that the idea that Black Muslims even exist comes to national US consciousness through surveillance of them. Right. Through COINTELPRO, through surveillance, through for Cold War fear that these two identities could intersect with each other. How do we articulate what Black Islam is?
Right. I mean, I first started using that term in my book, Muslim Cool, and I was using it to sort of try as an umbrella, like a big tent kind of term. I was using it as a way to try to think about the different ways in which Black people in the United States, and I think I was thinking primarily about the US, the ways Black people in the United States had been engaging what we know as Islam, right? It was a term that included groups that people consider heterodox and orthodox, right? Because for me, what united these groups was the ways in what they meant to Black people and Black communities. And I think they represented these alternative cosmologies, these alternative ways of being in the world, this commitment to Black liberation, this commitment to community and community empowerment, and like sort of in Black vernacular culture, this is what Islam looks like. So whether they are Moors from the Moor Science Temple or Shias, on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn or wherever, this is what this kind of meant. And while I think my term was very much, building out from what I was seeing in the United States, I see a similar kind of reverberation outside the US, right? In terms of what sort of the Black Islam means, or what Black people, so like a Malcolm X figure, like what does that mean around the world? What does that mean in different communities? So that's kind of where Black Islam kind of came from for me.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I think about this term Black Islam, I think about two conversations. One conversation I had recently with a friend of mine who is studying, sort of Islam in the Atlantic world, but mostly like West African Sufi communities, but also some of those communities, in the States. Anyway, he made, I think, a really important point about sort of what does that term Black Islam do? And he was really, sort of expressing a kind of ambivalence, or critique of the term. I think, kind of in line with this whole, when he said it, it made me think about this genealogy of Black Muslims in America and Islam noir, and how in some ways it has the potential, if not properly defined, of sort of relegating, Black folks Islam, at least not only in American context, but maybe even globally, to some kind of less authentic second tier kind of space. But then as I was reflecting on that, and I think those are some valid points and considerations. But I remember a conversation I had with another person who was a postdoc when I was a grad student, and not Muslim, very sort of a scholar of the African American intellectual traditions, very kind of comfortable with Islam and the symbology and the terminology and all of that, and the people, but not Muslim. And I was telling him about, my project, whatever kind of embryonic stage the project was at the moment. And he said, yeah, maybe we need a book called Black Islam, the way we have a Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. And I think that sort of coming from this kind of, academically, we can say a kind of Africana space, but also on the ground, a kind of Afrocentric, Black power, African political, cultural, nationalist space, whatever term you want to use. I think there is a way that there's kind of an appreciation and a suspicion on the part of a lot of folks that, Black folks have something to say about Islam, and a way of understanding and living Islam that maybe the rest of the world can benefit from. And I think about some of the work that folks are doing around, Islam in West Africa and whatnot, that speaks to that. So for me, and I don't, sometimes I use the term, sometimes I don't know how I feel about it yet, like most things in the world. But I think that for me, when I do use that term, I'm similarly speaking toward a kind of a way of understanding Islam that's informed by a global Black experience, right? And for me, it's important to, and I don't think it's important for every conversation, but when we're having conversations about, sort of, theology or kind of broad Islamic studies conversations, I think it's important to kind of, make clear, we're not talking about an Islam that is other than or adjacent to kind of the Islam. The argument is that this is the Islam, kind of done the right way, right? As opposed to a kind of, an Islam that is, sort of in the service of white supremacy, in the service of capitalism, in the service of different forms of oppression, in the service of the modern nation state. And so from that perspective, I think, when we talk about Black Islam, we're talking about an approach to Islam that's informed by the kind of radical cause for justice that animate much of the early genesis of the Muslim community, during the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the genesis of Islam among Black folks in the Atlantic world, which of course connects folks on both sides of the Atlantic. So
you should come back to this recording, Rasul, and transcribe that so you can put it in your book, because I think that was a perfect way of dealing with that. Okay, thanks.
Let me continue with something you said, Rasul. The way that you articulate global Blackness in relationship to Islam is an interesting one, because it decenters the kind of regionalism that we are used to thinking about when we think about Islam. Like, this is Middle Eastern Islam, this is this is Indian Islam, this is Asian Islam, or even that this is African Islam, but you're pointing toward a formulation of Blackness that is global, right? What does that do for us? Like, how can we translate that into a wider context of thinking about Islam in such a way that isn't like a center periphery model?
Right.
That centers, let's say, Saudi Muslims, right? Or centers a particular place as the be all and end all of Islam, and then, but instead, focuses on Blackness and just incorporates the wide range. I mean, we're talking about a problematic of Islam in general here.
Right.
How do we do that?
Right. Well, we have to start from the position of being far from Mecca. And, but no, I think that's exactly it. I think that, so I'm really interested in discussions of global Blackness, right? And, I'm kind of, you can kind of probably glean my particular political orientation from some of that, in terms of some of the discussions people are having around, this idea of American descendants of slavery and whatnot, just from the perspective of, not to go too deep into that rabbit hole, because that deserves its own kind of conversation. But just from the standpoint of, for me, because I'm, like Dr. Suad, I'm a product of this history I'm studying, So, my pops is, has lived this, right? So for me, my conception of Blackness has never been sort of confined to the American nation state or, the peer view of the, American, slave catchers. So, this idea of Blackness as something that connects the descendants of enslaved folks and, people who are racialized as, Negro in America, to this broader, global community of formerly colonized people around different forms of, kind of linkages, whether it be African ancestry, whether it be, status as a formerly colonized person, whether it be, Islam, whether it be, just sort of, what's the word I want to use? All of these different sort of, just kind of a radical internationalism generally, right? All of that, I think, when we think about a sort of global Blackness, right? It decenters a way of defining race and a way of defining identity that is in the service of American racism and white supremacy. It has the potential to do that. It might not do that if we don't do it right, but I think it has the potential to do that. So I think when we talk about, when we use that framework as a lens to sort of understand Islam, I think it can do a couple of things. I think one, it helps us to understand how Muslims who are racialized as Black have been in conversation with each other, for a long time. If we go back into the history of transatlantic slavery, we see how folks on different sides of the Atlantic are sort of in a conversation with each other and informed about one another doing. But also, I think it has the ability to kind of, in some ways, help us sort of undo some of the epistemological damage that's done by the sort of modern era, which is characterized by white supremacy and the modern nation state, right? So for me, when we talk about a kind of Black Islam, in that context, it helps us to get to a time before the transatlantic slave trade and global white supremacy made Black a certain thing, right? And, that's not to say that, that if we were to, I also don't want to sort of superimpose, I don't want to superimpose any kind of like modern construct about race and identity on what was happening 1400 years ago, right? I think that's a danger. But I think because, the dynamics of, white supremacy and a certain approach to history are so powerful, I'm not that worried about Black Islam making people think, you know what I mean, that, people feel like the Prophet Muhammad's Islam was a an advocate of Black power. I mean, yeah, he was. So that's okay. I'm not too worried about that, right? But I think that can kind of help us undo some of that psychological damage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
And I just want to add one thing. I think I was thinking about this when the question about Black Islam, I think because as an anthropologist, I think I came to the question or to the idea really ethnographically, right? And so I'm thinking about what is it that we're seeing in real time, in real life, at the moment in which I was looking, and even this question of Black Muslim, this is history of like sort of Nation Islam being called the Black Muslims, and we're like, they don't call themselves that, but someone else calling that. But then there's a shift, I think, in sort of like realities for people who are Black and Muslim, in which kind of claiming Black as an identifier, right, for your Muslimness becomes important. So like there's been a sort of a historical shift where that sort of becomes something that, yes, that was that legacy of how that term, played itself out, but that's not necessarily what it means sort of ethnographically, sort of speaking, right, to people or to some people in certain parts. And I think also, this question of like, Blackness too, I think for me, and I guess again, this might be a disciplinary thing or whatever, but I also think I'm sort of really interested in like what these things mean to people in the places they are now and what they're trying to create and build, right? So we can have conversations about, Blackness and race, before sort of European colonization and that kind of thing, which I think are important and fruitful and those kinds of things. But for me, I think my interest tends to be more in terms of like, what is the work that these terms do, right, for everyday people in their lives, right? And tracking what that is to understand, kind of like what is happening, right? So that we can kind of figure out, well, what do we want to happen, and not so much just as a scholar, but also as a part of community, right? Like so you want to know what's going on because you also have a vision and you also want to support so particular kind of articulation. So yeah.
Let me invite the audience to, put your questions in the Q&A while we continue this conversation. Feel free to do that. But I want to pick up on, speaking of terminology, So I want to ask you about Black Arabic.
Mhm.
I've read some of I think yes, I read a description of the way that you use the term umi, meaning mother, mommy, in a way that you describe not just as Arabic but as Black Arabic.
Right.
What does that term mean, or what does that signify to you?
Yeah. So I actually kind of started using that term for a piece, like an article I wrote when I was, I guess, still a graduate student or wanting to be a graduate student. And because I was really intrigued by the ways in which the Arabic language showed up in sort of everyday speech by sort of Black US American Muslims. And so I did some, sort of in New York City where I was located, some sort of ethnographic fieldwork thinking about that. And I was studying linguistic anthropology, so that's what I was doing. And what I kind of uncovered was that, and this is what we know generally about language, right? This idea that sort of words, it's not just what words we use, but how we use them, when we use them, why we use them, right? They really teach us a lot about sort of cultural priorities, interests, anxieties, etc. And so I found that, the Arabic language didn't show up in the way people spoke sort of haphazardly. It showed up in very specific kinds of ways. So for example, it will show up, for example, I have this thing, and people, anyone who knows me, like, you'll never call my scarf a hijab. I'm like, don't do it. Don't call it hijab, like, whatever. Because I grew up calling my scarf in Arabic term, khimar. And khimar is the term that comes directly from the Quranic verse that talks about female modesty, right? So there's this way in which Arabic language enters sort of Black Muslim lexicons because of study, right? Because of internet, because of because people are studying their religion. So they're taking very specific, even clinical terms, right? You know what I mean? And they're making them like everyday language. Or ummi. And I was making the point too, I was like, it's not ummi. Like, people were spelling it, because I spell it UMI. And people were sort of like, UMMI, making this ummi. Because there might be a shadda in Arabic, but that's not what we're saying. We're not saying ummi. That's not what we're doing, right? And so this idea of trying to, sort of the idea of sort of becoming Muslim and finding ways that both connect you to, right, a Muslim past, which is often also an African past, and also make you distinct from your present, right? So language is a way this happens. And so you'll find people, instructing their kids to call them Umi, right, or Abu, right? Or people being called by, right, like, the mother of so-and-so, right? Which is this kind of like classic kind of Arabic or Arabic language, right, or Arab tradition that ends up, people on Bed-Stuy, like on Frank Fulton and Ocean, on Bilal, come here and get, come here and get this, whatever, type of thing. And so for me, I guess Black Arabic then is a way of identifying kind of how identity is being made, right? How people who become Muslim, who are of African descent, how they make and create and recreate that identity for themselves.
Yeah. I love the example of the word kimar, because I grew up in Guyana, Caribbean, calling it a kimar as well, and that is, a combination of Indian Islam and Black Islam too, right? I mean, learning to say hijab when we moved to the United States, it still feels like a foreign thing in my mouth. To call that a hijab. There's other words for it, right, that we use. I want you to tell us about that sweatshirt.
Oh yeah. Okay. So by the way, I do see two questions, I think, maybe in the chat. But so Hajar, so this says Hajar, which is the Arabic for Hagar, and Hagar was, depending on how you see, she was either the consort or the wife of Abraham, right? And she's the father of his son Ismail, or Ishmael in the biblical tradition. And so it says Hajar, hashtag Black Girl Magic, since the time of Abraham. And so basically what it is I wrote a poem about this. I'm thinking about who she meant, like who she was as a Black woman, myself as a Black woman, as a Black Muslim woman, and thinking about, what her building really off of Amina Wadud's work of thinking about Hagar as a sort of a single Black mother, right? And when she ends up in what is now today Mecca with her son, and what that symbolism, what that parallel means for thinking about my experience or the experience of other Black women and Black Muslim women. And so Sapelo Square, what we did as a, because we're all volunteer organization that's been doing amazing stuff, but on a shoestring budget. So what we did was we created these sweatshirts with this kind of tagline to both kind of rep the ancestors, right? But also build a future, right? Because the point of thinking about who she is to think about who we are, what we want. So you can get your Hajar Black Girl Magic t-shirt, you go to sapelosquare.com to get it. But I think, and this goes back to maybe the point I was trying to make before, this idea of claiming Blackness in a particular kind of way that I think, to be honest, I think has a lot to do with interactions with non-Black Muslims for a particular generation. I think sort of, say my mother's generation claimed Blackness vis-a-vis whiteness and vis-a-vis white supremacy to sort of embrace and love who they are. Right. I think that I find, and maybe not my generation, maybe the next below, maybe millennials or Gen Zs, I think find like to claiming Blackness as Muslims, vis-a-vis the anti-Blackness that they experience from non-white, but also non-Black, right? Muslims of color.
I want to get back to that point, but let me ask one of our audience members, Muna Mana, wants to ask you another question about Black Arabic. So this person says, Black Arabic, yes. What kind of research would you like to see on this topic today? And that's for both of you.
Well, my answer is more, because I feel like I wrote the article and I was like, it was very preliminary. So I'm like, somebody else needs to, pick that up and run with it.
I remember reading that article as a grad student and digging. I was like, this is awesome.
We have a question from an anonymous audience member. Considering that the Arabian Peninsula is in Northeast Africa, they would like you to talk about how Black Black Islam connects directly to the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace.
So I answered, it's funny because I actually saw that question and was like, well, my answer to the former question is an answer to this question. So I'm actually working on a piece right now where I'm looking at, among other things, an important early 20th century figure named Professor Muhammad Izzuddin. And this was a brother who was a member of the Moorish Science Temple who left and embraced, Orthodox or Sunni Islam and spent some time in the Muslim world and came back and founded probably the first, sort of national umbrella organization for Muslims in America, at least founded by, someone who was American born. And it was called the Adino Allahi Universal Arabic Association, right? And it was very much informed by this kind of historiography that sort of points to the relationship between what we, now refer to as the Middle East or the Arab world and Africa, right? Sort of, putting Egypt and Arabia back in Africa, right? And I think that, folks who were doing this in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s were often, I'm getting a feedback. Are y'all hearing that too? Or is that just on my end? I don't know why. Sorry. But oftentimes people, then and now kind of, sort of dismiss these kind of arguments. And there's some interesting debates, happening between, around sort of what does it mean for Black people from the US to sort of, reclaim or appropriate these histories of places like North Africa and Egypt. And I think there's some interesting points on both sides. People who like it, people who don't like it. I think it's a fruitful discussion. But, the reality is there's a lot of truth to this kind of historical rendering that says like, no, the Arab world is not, this kind of entity that's wholly separate from the African continent. If we look at, I recently was, giving a talk and we talked about the story of Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anhu and Abu Dhar al-Ghifari radiallahu anhu, the Sahaba that a Sahaba basically referred to Bilal, another Sahaba that we kind of always think of as Black, one of the few companions of the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, that we think about as being Black. This other Sahaba says to him when he gets mad, he says, "Oh, you son of a Black mother," right? And the Prophet, praise and peace be upon him, is informed about it. And, he gets mad and he he basically tells, that companion, you still have some ignorance in you. And that companion is moved. He cries. He puts his face on the ground and asks Bilal to forgive him. Bilal forgives him. But what we don't know, many of us, and what's kind of, sort of papered over in the history, is that he's also someone who we would describe as Black today, right? So these are two Black companions of the Prophet having an exchange that has more to do with distinctions of culture, distinctions of lineage, distinctions of language, right? Than what we call race today, right? And that's important because it helps us to understand the fact that this idea that Islam and even Arabness is this thing that's distinct from Blackness is a product of white supremacy, modern white supremacist historiography that tries to take everything good that darker skinned folks have done and wrestle it away from people that we would consider Black and who get, racialized as Black and oppressed today, right? So I guess the short answer is yes. Like, it would make just as much sense to refer to the Arabian Peninsula as Northeast Africa as it does anything else, right? These kind of distinctions are fluid. Is it Asia? Is it Africa? Well, it's a peninsula. What's a peninsula? A body of water connected to the continent. A body of land connected to the continent, connected, surrounded on three sides by water. It's connected to both the African continent and, what we think of as the Asian continent. If we look at southern Yemen, right, we see, it's very hard to distinguish culturally, linguistically between southern Yemen and the Horn of Africa, right? And so I think in many ways, what Black Muslims and, a certain kind of genealogy of Black intellectuals from the US and other places, what folks realized at a very early time was that race is socially constructed and historically constructed, and began to craft histories that were more accurate, that pointed to the kind of Africanity of people on the Arabian Peninsula, people of North Africa, people of Egypt, right? And this history is complex and complicated, but there's truth to that, right? And I think in many ways, what I hope we can do now is go back and look at what some of these folks on the ground were saying, even some of the intellectual folks who laid the groundwork for the emergence of Black Hebrew Israelite, traditions, right? A lot of what they said was true, right? And a lot of what they said was more historically informed than we give it credit for being. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm so glad you brought up that point about who is racialized as Black may not necessarily have anything to do with their ethnic origin, their cultural origin, their national origin, their place in Islamic history. And that question about Bilal, it is a constant source of irritation for me that when you say to a lot of Muslims today, when you say anything about Black Muslim, Black Islam, the first thing they're gonna be like is, oh, Bilal. And it's like, is that really all you got? Like, is Bilal all you got? What about like centuries of West African Islamic schools? Like, what else do you have there? There's a lot more.
Right.
We have a question from another anonymous audience member. I love the idea that our personal histories are important to study, for example, such as with Umi's archive. But one thing I find difficult is that people tend to dismiss personal stories. This question is for us, Suad, but I think you can both answer it as people who identify as Black Muslim yourselves and as practicing Muslims. What kind of issues do you have with that when you are doing your work, when you are doing scholarship? It comes back to this original question or this original point that I think both of you were making about epistemology. Any advice with how to get our own personal stories and histories taken seriously in academia? And along with that, I want to add specifically like our own personal religious identities, because, in the secular context of academia, that is often anathema.
Well, I can start because I don't know.
Yeah.
You can start.
So we had a question we just had a question from an audience member who was asking about how do we get our personal stories and identities. I guess in some ways, respected as part of academic scholarship? How do we change that epistemology? How do we incorporate, the fact that we ourselves might be practicing Muslims, and you might identify as Black Muslim? How do you incorporate that in your work, especially when you're thinking about, like, the secular academy?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, because I'm hearing feedback too. But I think my first response to that is just you have to respect it, right? I think you have to respect it, and you have to sort of acknowledge its significance, right, for yourself. Then I think you have to create a cohort of people that you're working with, that you're citing, that's citing you, that are also doing that to create, because citations are really important, right, in academic work, right? And so it's kind of thinking about, okay, well, who am I citing? Who's already done this? Because also that's something too, like, I'm not the first person to say that, we're not the first people to talk about this, right? So it's also kind of an intellectual genealogy around these questions as well that I think need to be also embraced. And so I think it's about both kind of, for the individual understanding its significance and what that means and what you want it to do. And then likewise, then building a community of scholars which you are engaged with, right? Who are creating an intellectual body of work that also speaks to the significance. And publishing on that and writing about that and publishing, and there's going to be people who are going to sort of undercut it. There are people who are going to say that's not real or whatever, and you just ignore them, right? But you have to kind of, sort of have self-determination as a scholar, right? I think when it comes to these kind of things. And the reason why I think publishing or writing together or citing is important is because if you do end up in an academic position, right? So say you're an assistant professor, you will need to have backup, right? And so we build that backup, right? I think through the intellectual exchanges that we have.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I think that's exactly on point. I'll say that when you do that, it works. When you take it seriously and when you kind of assert that this stuff is important, I think, you're able to open up doors for yourself, in academia. I love what you said. You have to respect it. I think that maybe I'm, kind of naive, whatever, but I think things are changing. I think about, a scholar that I know, I think we're all, pretty, we know a guy by the name of John Jackson, Professor John Jackson, who wrote a book called Thin Description. He's talking about African Hebrew Israelites. And the title is kind of a play on this idea, this Gertz idea, thick description, without getting bogged down into academic stuff. Basically, the notion that you should take seriously what people say about themselves, what communities say about themselves, instead of kind of, sort of celebrating this academic outsider gaze, right? And I think there are enough of us, and this is something I say a lot of times to folks who are outside of academia, who I think have a very healthy distrust of academia. There's more and more of us in the space who are asserting that, this history is important, our perspectives on the history are important. And I think that is, I don't know if it's transforming academia, but at least there's more stuff out there that you can draw on. And I think it, every person who does this work, right, makes it easier for the people coming behind them, right? Even like, Dr. Suad said something as sort of simple, I guess, as citational practices. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Rudolph Ware, who wrote a book called The Walking Quran. One of the things he said to me, he said, I wanted to write a book that people coming after me could cite, so they don't have to do all this cumbersome work of, saying why folks who've written about Islam in Africa are problematic. Just cite it and now build on it, and I think that's certainly something that y'all are doing and have done. And I think it works. I can attest to the fact that it works. Even my time navigating grad school was so much easier because folks who came before me had already kind of like threw down the gauntlet and fought a lot of those fights. So
we got a couple of questions from audience members who would like your suggestions for some readings. So one from Carolyn Beery, Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer, Assalamu alaikum, sister Anastada. Thank you for all of your land and space acknowledgements, for me especially the one on Ashura. I'm currently researching a paper on the unique position of Africana Muslim Muhajaba women, and I would like to know about scholars in or outside of academia who you think fit that description. Really broad, yeah.
I mean, I definitely think, like Deborah Majid's work is really important to think about that. I would also look at Sylvia Chan's book, Being Muslim, Jamila Karim's work on women in the Nation of Islam in particular. Why am I blanking on some other folks that I think would be good people to sort of think about? Kayla Wheeler is an emerging scholar who also does work thinking about fashion, and she's done some things on Sapelo Square that you can read, thinking about this question of sort of Africana Muslim women and dress and just identity and those type of things. So those are some of the folks I would, off the top, immediately recommend looking into.
Mm-hmm. I don't, if you want to add to that, Rasul. We also have a question too that either one of you can take. Professor Samar Ali here asks, I've become interested in the Darul Islam movement, but it's challenging to find scholarship. If you know of any potential archive or scholarship on that.
Yes, I just posted in the chat. I guess only the panelists could see it, but maybe you can share just a few links. One is to a website. It's called the Darul Islam Collection. It's curated by a sister named Khalila Barber, who is the daughter of a photographer from the Darul Islam movement. And she has this awesome website where, she has this awesome website where she, it's kind of like a photo chronicling of Darul Islam movement's work, and you see everything from their printing press to, their halal meat store, so I would definitely recommend that. And I put the link to a couple of memoirs that were written by folks from the Darul Islam movement. Actually, I would say two of the sort of, in terms of folks in the movement, sort of most sort of, I don't know how to put it, but sort of most qualified to kind of tell the history of the movement, because they're sort of intellectual folks. One of them is actually a professor, so they have some academic training, but they're from the community, so they've written these two memoirs. I tried to give you links that were not Amazon links because I'm not really about pubbing for Amazon. One of them I could find, one of them I couldn't. So if you could find somewhere other than Amazon to get it, then do that. And there's some other stuff. There's there's an article by a guy named Mukhtar Curtis that was written a while ago, but I think it's still one of the best sort of, summations of the Darul Islam movement out there. And there's a lot of stuff coming out. I'm working on some stuff. There's some other people working on stuff that I think, in a couple of years we'll have more, but hopefully the person who asked the question, will also be able to, contribute. And there's also in the book, Black Pilgrimage to Islam, there's some stuff about the Dar. I think it has some value. You can make critiques about anything that's produced, but so those are some places to start.
We're almost out of time here, but there's one question from an audience member that I think goes back to what, Saad, you were saying about claiming Blackness, claiming Black Muslimness and Black Islam as a way to counter anti-Blackness, particularly for, maybe millennial, Gen Z, for youth in general. So let's see if we can end with getting into this one question here from our audience member, Loe Al-Aram. Thank you both for this very thoughtful conversation. I was wondering if in your research, you feel like you have to answer to or attend to or not non-Black Muslim anti-Blackness or white supremacy, particularly in terms of producing a kind of scholarship that is public facing or that can be taken up in activist spaces. Or is it more generative to focus on building solidarity with Black non-Muslims in understanding the centrality of Islam to Black radical thought and Black liberation? That's an interesting question. I think either one of you could start on that one.
All right, well, since Dr. Suwad is muted, I'm going to take that as a cue. So, I mean, I think that's an excellent question and a really important one and a layered one with no simple answer. I think you have to do both. I, for one, am someone who is still very much invested in, multiracial, radical internationalist political coalitions. That's me. Everybody might not be interested in that, but I'm interested in that, right? So I think that there is value in the solidarity piece. Having said that, you have to call out, anti-Black racism, even when it's, when it manifests at the hands or off the tongues of, you know, non-white people, you know. And I think that when you talk about the centrality of Islam to Black radical thought, you know, I think that when you foreground that history, it does two things. One, it helps to build solidarity, but it also gives sincere non-Black people, right, some tools to help them counter, and particularly if they're Muslim, some tools to help them undo their own, you know, sort of internalized white supremacy, right? So that's where I think, you know, we should come at it from. You know, I don't really find any value in taking a political orientation that says, you know, I'm waving the flag for Black US American, you know, folks. And sort of that's all I really care about, because the reality is that's never accomplished anything politically. Virtually every successful Black radical revolutionary movement in this part of the world has had some kind of internationalist, you know, sort of orientation, whether you're talking about Frederick Douglass, whether you're talking about the civil rights movement in the context of the Cold War, you know. So I think you have to do both. But I think in the current moment that we're in, there are people who have a vested interest in getting Black people in the US to think domestically and to isolate themselves. And there are people who are funding that kind of political project. And so I think it's very important that we, you know, are able to walk and chew gum at the same time with regard to this issue.
I mean, I think Rasul said that well. I mean, I think in my own work, there was an attention to anti-Blackness by non-Black Muslims as a way of demonstrating how anti-Blackness functions, right? So thinking about, you know, how the relationship between Blackness and Muslimness can help us understand what resistance looked like, but also what co-optation looks like. And so that, I think, was kind of the emphasis of the point in my book. I think outside of my book and my work, like say with Sapelo Square, with Umi's archive, you know, I think it's important to sort of, you know, acknowledge the things that are happening, but that's not what drives the work, right? And so what drives the work is, you know, I said this recently about Sapelo Square, you know, it came out of a place of self-love. That's why we created this, right? Because we wanted something for ourselves. And so if it addresses this other stuff as a part of that, that's cool, but that's not kind of what the motivation is. You know, and I think with any of our work, right, we have our motivations. And so, you know, I think it's important, you know, to remember that, right? And so the motivation is, for me, for example, my work is about, you know, sort of really thinking with Black Islam, thinking with everyday Black people, to sort of understand, better understand the world we live in, and to come up with some, you know, feasible ways to sort of address the really significant problems we're facing.
I really like that. I like that as a note to end on, right? That thinking about this is thinking about it as an act of self-love, not as defensiveness or reactionariness or any sort of, any sort of defensive notion of what Blackness is, Black Islam is, and so on. So thank you very much. This is all the time we got. I wish we could keep talking about this. I think we could keep talking about this forever, and I hope we do. But thank you very much to our speakers, Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer and Dr. Rasul Miller, and to all of our co-sponsors. Please check out Sapelo Square, Umi's archives, and Dr. Miller's forthcoming work on Black internationalism. And as a reminder, if you want to hear about similar events from us, including our upcoming chaplaincy event, please sign up for the Global Islamic Studies newsletter. Thank you to everybody for attending.
Thank you.
There you go.